There is a transcript that exists in the archives of the Association for Research and Enlightenment that almost no one was meant to see. It was created in 1943 during the final years of Edgar Cayce's life when his physical body was weakening, but his access to the Akashic records had never been clearer. On that particular afternoon, Cayce entered one of his deepest trance states. His breathing slowed, his consciousness withdrew from ordinary reality. And when he began to speak, the stenographer in the room later said she felt the temperature drop. He was describing America's future, not the near future, not the comfortable predictions people wanted to hear about post-war prosperity and technological advancement. He was speaking about a specific window of time beginning in the year 2027. A threshold moment that would fundamentally alter not just the geography of this nation, but the spiritual identity of everyone living within it. The reading was so disturbing in its implications that when Cayce awakened, he refused to discuss it. The transcript was marked with a notation, restricted circulation. For decades, it remained buried in the organization's private files, shared only among senior researchers who understood the magnitude of what had been revealed. But here is what almost everyone misunderstood about that reading and about Edgar Cayce's prophetic vision in general. He was not describing America's destruction. He was describing its rebirth. The catastrophe and the transformation were not separate events. They were two faces of the same evolutionary process. What appeared as collapse was actually the dismantling of structures that could no longer contain the consciousness that was emerging. In the next 40 minutes, you are going to discover what Edgar Cayce actually saw when he looked beyond 2027. Not through the lens of fear, but through the lens of initiation. Not as the end of America, but as the beginning of what he called the nation's true purpose. The events he described are already beginning. The signs are appearing in ways that would have seemed impossible even 5 years ago, and the timeline he gave with such precision is accelerating faster than anyone anticipated. Whether you are ready or not, what comes after 2027 will test everything you believe about who America is and what it is meant to become. This is not about creating fear. This is about preparation for the most significant shift in American history since the founding itself. And if you are hearing these words right now at this exact moment in time, that is not an accident. Your soul already knows what is coming. Before we can understand what Edgar Cayce saw in America's future, we must understand his unique relationship with this nation itself. He was not simply a psychic who happened to live in Virginia. Cayce believed based on his own life readings that his soul had incarnated specifically to witness and document America's karmic journey through a crucial turning point in human evolution. In reading after reading, he described America as what he called a soul experiment, a place where the unresolved karma of multiple ancient civilizations had converged for collective resolution. Atlantean souls carrying the memory of technological power misused. Egyptian souls holding the imprint of spiritual wisdom corrupted by priestcraft. Persian souls bearing the weight of empire and conquest. All of them reincarnating on this continent, drawn together not by accident but by karmic necessity. Coming to complete unfinished spiritual business in a land that represented in its founding documents, if not always in its practice, the possibility of a different way, freedom, unity through diversity, the recognition of inherent human dignity. These were not just political ideals to Cayce. They were spiritual principles encoded into the energetic blueprint of the nation itself, waiting to be fully actualized. But actualization requires purification. People who witnessed Cayce during his America prophecy sessions said these readings were different from his others. When he gave medical readings, he was calm, precise, almost clinical. When he described past lives, he was often matter-of-fact, occasionally curious. But when he entered the future timeline of America, something else happened. He would sometimes weep during the trance state. His body would become agitated. Upon awakening, he would be visibly shaken as if he had witnessed something that carried immense emotional weight. Yet he also said repeatedly with absolute conviction, America's greatest test will become its greatest awakening. This dual nature is the key to everything that follows. Cayce was not seeing punishment descending upon a sinful nation. He was seeing initiation on a national scale. The kind of dark night of the soul that precedes every genuine transformation. Just as an individual must confront their shadow before they can integrate their light, a nation must face the full truth of what it has been, before it can become what it is meant to be. And America, according to Cayce, was approaching that moment of reckoning with extraordinary speed. Now, we arrive at the specific date that appears throughout Cayce's most controversial readings, between 1934 and 1944. Across multiple sessions with different seekers asking different questions. This year emerged again and again, sometimes directly stated, sometimes implied through cyclical calculations, but always marking the same thing, a threshold crossing. Cayce used different language to describe it depending on the context of the reading. Sometimes he called it the year of reckoning, other times the threshold crossing. In one particularly cryptic session, he referred to it as when the mask falls away. He never explicitly explained why 2027 carried this significance. But researchers studying his readings have discovered something extraordinary. The year 2027 marks exactly 250 years from 1777, when the Articles of Confederation were ratified. America's first attempt at unified government, the initial blueprint before the Constitution. In Cayce's cosmology of cycles and spiritual mathematics, 250-year periods represent complete karmic rotations, moments when a soul or a collective soul like a nation must account for everything it has become since a significant beginning point. A full harvest of what was planted. And what was planted in 1777 was both luminous and shadowed. The language of freedom existed alongside the practice of enslavement. The recognition of inherent rights existed alongside the genocide of indigenous peoples. The vision of unity existed alongside the structure of hierarchy. These contradictions were not accidental. They were the exact karmic material that needed to be worked through the spiritual curriculum that America as a collective soul had agreed to engage. But according to Cayce, by 2027, time would run out on the possibility of gradual integration. He said that beginning in this threshold year, 3 specific processes would accelerate simultaneously, not in sequence, simultaneously like 3 instruments in a symphony suddenly increasing in volume together. The first process, geographical disruption, with the land itself responding to shifts in collective consciousness. The second process, institutional collapse, with structures built on obsolete frequencies losing their ability to maintain coherence. The third process, spiritual awakening, a rupture in consensus reality that would force millions of people to recognize that they were multidimensional beings inhabiting temporary human forms. Cayce insisted these were not separate events happening to coincide. They were 3 faces of the same transformation. The earth would shake because the consciousness was shifting. You cannot change the frequency of awareness without the physical reality adjusting to match. Institutions would crumble because they were built on principles of force, control, and extraction. And those principles were becoming energetically impossible to sustain. As the collective vibration rose, and amid the chaos and breakdown of everything familiar, a new awareness would emerge, but only for those who had prepared themselves to receive it. Let us be very clear about what Edgar Cayce actually said regarding the earth changes, because this is where his prophecies have been most distorted by fear-based interpretations. He was not predicting random geological disasters. He was describing the land's response to human consciousness starting around 2027 and intensifying through 2028. Cayce spoke of specific geographical transformations that would begin to alter America's physical landscape. But he emphasized something that most people ignore. These changes would not be random. They would occur in regions where the collective shadow had been most concentrated, where violence had soaked into the soil, where greed had poisoned the water, where exploitation had fractured the energetic integrity of place. The earth, Cayce said, has consciousness. It is not inert matter. It is a living being that absorbs and holds the emotional and spiritual imprints of what happens upon it. And when a nation's consciousness begins to shift dramatically, when millions of souls simultaneously start awakening to a higher frequency, the land must adjust to match that new vibration. In one preserved reading from 1936, Cayce described what he called the Great Lakes connecting to the Gulf. Researchers have interpreted this in various ways. Some believe he was speaking literally about massive flooding or seismic activity that would create new waterways through the Midwest. Others interpret it more symbolically as the dissolution of artificial boundaries. But the core message remains consistent. The heartland of America, the agricultural center that had fed the nation while exhausting the soil through industrial farming practices, would experience a fundamental restructuring. He spoke about California experiencing what he called the first of three major adjustments. Sections of coastline reshaping, geological instability in regions that had been built up with extraordinary density despite sitting on known fault lines. This was not divine punishment for California's progressive politics, as some interpreters have suggested. It was the land releasing accumulated tension, the earth itself shaking loose structures that were built on unsustainable foundations, both literally and energetically. Perhaps most startling were his descriptions of new volcanic activity in unexpected regions. The Carolinas and Arkansas, areas where indigenous peoples had been violently displaced, where sacred sites had been desecrated, where the trauma of genocide had never been properly acknowledged or healed. Cayce said these eruptions would not be massive in scale like Mount St. Helens. They would be what he called earth-breathing, the land releasing pressure that had built up over centuries. If this sounds impossible to you, I ask you to consider what is already happening. Earthquakes in regions once considered geologically stable. Flooding patterns that defy every historical model. Sinkholes appearing in areas where the ground was thought to be solid. Volcanic activity increasing globally at rates that perplex scientists. The first wave is not coming in some distant future. It has already begun. And those who understand what Cayce actually said are not preparing in panic. They are preparing in wisdom. Recognizing that the earth changes are not an enemy to fear, but a process to work with consciously. The second phase of America's transformation that Cayce described involves something far more unsettling to most people than geological upheaval. He spoke of what he called the great economic illusion collapsing between 2028 and 2030. He described America's financial systems experiencing a breakdown so complete that money itself would temporarily lose its agreed-upon meaning. But here is what makes this prophecy different from typical economic collapse predictions. Cayce said this would not be caused by external attack, not by foreign manipulation of markets, not by natural disasters destroying infrastructure. It would be caused by a collective awakening to the fact that the entire system was built on shared fiction. In a reading from 1938, he said something that sounds almost prophetic of modern cryptocurrency and digital finance. He spoke about the veil lifting from currency, a moment when enough people simultaneously recognize that money only has power because of collective belief. That gold has no intrinsic value beyond what consciousness assigns to it. That paper currency is just paper. That digital numbers in banking systems are just agreed-upon concepts with no physical reality at all. When that recognition reaches critical mass, Cayce said the system simply stops functioning. He described a period of months, possibly extending into years, where barter systems would spontaneously emerge across America, where communities would self-organize around resource sharing rather than capital accumulation, and where the question would no longer be, what can you pay? But, what can you offer? What skills do you have? What wisdom do you carry? What role will you play in maintaining the collective well-being? Cayce said this phase would be the hardest on those who had accumulated the most wealth because their entire identity structure would dissolve overnight. People who had measured their worth by their net worth would suddenly have no framework for understanding who they were. But for those already living simply, already valuing connection over consumption, already practicing mutual aid and gift economy principles, this phase would feel almost like liberation, a weight being lifted that they had not realized they were carrying. In one particularly detailed reading, a businessman asked Cayce how to protect his investments through the coming changes. And Cayce's response, delivered from a trance state, was extraordinarily direct. He said, "Invest in people. Invest in skills. Invest in land that can grow food. Invest in relationships that will hold when paper promises become meaningless. Your wealth is not what you own. Your wealth is who you are and what you can contribute when systems collapse." Cayce emphasized that this economic dissolution was not punishment for capitalism's excesses. Though there were certainly excesses to account for, it was necessary clearing. America could not step into its true purpose while still operating on what Cayce called Atlantean economic principles. The few controlling resources meant for the many. The hoarding of abundance, the artificial creation of scarcity to maintain power. That entire paradigm was ending, not because anyone was destroying it from outside, but because it was becoming energetically impossible to sustain as consciousness evolved. The question was not whether this would happen, but who would be prepared for what came after. Now we come to the aspect of Cayce's prophecy that his own foundation was most reluctant to discuss publicly because it sounds on the surface like mass psychosis. Between 2029 and 2031, he described a period he called the Great Revealing, a time when the majority of Americans would simultaneously experience what can only be described as a rupture in consensus reality. He said people would begin perceiving things that had always been there but had been filtered out by the limitations of ordinary waking consciousness. Energies, presences, memories that did not belong to their current lifetime, connections to other dimensions of existence. In multiple readings, Cayce was asked to clarify what he meant by this, and his answers were consistent. He was not describing hallucinations. He was not speaking metaphorically about psychological changes. He was describing the veil between dimensions thinning to the point where multidimensional reality would become unavoidable for most people, not just for trained mystics or natural sensitives. Cayce said that during this phase, phenomena currently dismissed as paranormal would become commonplace. Widespread experiences of telepathy, where people would suddenly know things about others without any physical communication. Visible energy fields around people and places, what some call auras, but extending beyond that into seeing the emotional and spiritual imprints that locations carry. Spontaneous past life memory activation, where people would suddenly remember other incarnations with the same vividness they remember childhood in this life. And perhaps most challenging for materialist worldviews, contact with non-physical intelligences, beings from other dimensions, guides and teachers who had always been present but invisible to ordinary perception. He predicted that institutions would initially attempt to pathologize these experiences. That science, medicine, and religion would scramble to label this widespread awakening as mental illness. New diagnostic categories would be created. Medications would be prescribed. People would be told they were experiencing psychotic breaks or dissociative episodes. But the sheer number of people experiencing these phenomena would make that narrative impossible to maintain. When millions of people across every demographic are simultaneously perceiving multidimensional reality, you cannot simply medicalize it away. In one preserved case from the AR archives, Cayce described what this consciousness rupture would feel like from the inside. He said it would be like suddenly remembering that you were dreaming while still inside the dream. The dream does not disappear. The physical world remains physical. But you recognize it as just one layer of a much more vast reality. And that recognition changes everything. How you relate to your body, how you understand death, how you perceive other people, how you make decisions. Cayce emphasized that this consciousness rupture would be disorienting and frightening for many people, especially those who had built their entire identity on materialist assumptions. But it was absolutely necessary. America's evolution and humanity's evolution required remembering what had been forgotten. That we are multidimensional beings having a temporary human experience, not humans occasionally having spiritual experiences. That shift in fundamental identity from body to soul, from form to consciousness, was the entire point of the 2027 threshold. Everything else was just clearing the way for it. Most people who study Edgar Cayce's prophecies focus entirely on the chaos years, the breakdown, the dramatic earth changes and economic dissolution and consciousness rupture. But Cayce actually described what comes after those waves with equal specificity. And this is where his vision becomes genuinely hopeful rather than apocalyptic. Around 2032, he said, a new form of governance would begin emerging in America, not imposed from above by reformers or revolutionaries, but self-organizing from below from communities that had learned to function together during the crisis years. He called it the council system. In multiple readings, he described how this would manifest. Communities, particularly those that had maintained coherence during the dissolution period, would form localized decision-making bodies. But these would not be governments in the traditional sense. They would not operate through legislation and enforcement. They would not be based on political ideologies or party affiliations. Instead, they would be composed of people recognized by their communities as spiritually mature, not elected through campaigns and voting, but naturally acknowledged as wisdom keepers. People who had demonstrated during the crisis that they could remain grounded when others panicked, who could hold vision when others despaired, who could facilitate collective discernment rather than imposing personal agendas. Cayce said these councils would not govern, they would facilitate. They would hold space for communities to make decisions through what he called unanimous recognition of truth. A process that sounds impossible until you understand the premise behind it. By 2032, enough Americans would have completed the consciousness rupture that a new form of collective knowing would be possible. Not voting, where 51% overrides 49% and half the community remains resentful, but a form of telepathic consensus in which solutions that serve the highest good of all would become obvious to everyone simultaneously. If you are hearing this and thinking it sounds like science fiction, I understand the skepticism. But Cayce was describing a natural evolution of human consciousness that had been documented in indigenous cultures and mystical traditions for millennia. The ability to perceive truth directly, not through debate and argument, but through spiritual attunement. He said, America was uniquely positioned for this transformation because its founding documents, despite being imperfectly implemented for 250 years, had encoded the language of inherent freedom. That seed had been planted. It had grown in shadow, twisted by the contradictions between stated ideals and actual practice. But the seed itself was genuine. And in 2032, after the fires of transformation had burned away everything false, that seed would finally germinate, in ways the founders themselves could never have imagined. A nation governed not by force, but by wisdom, not by power over, but by service to, not by control, but by facilitation of each soul's highest unfolding. Here is where Edgar Cayce's prophecy becomes deeply personal for many of you watching this video right now. In several readings from the early 1940s, when he was asked about the future of America and humanity, he spoke about a specific generation of souls who would begin incarnating around the year 2020. He said these were not random births. They were souls who had spent multiple lifetimes preparing for this exact moment in human evolution. He called them bridge souls. Beings who had incarnated at other pivotal transition points in human history, who had experience holding space during collective transformation, who had developed over many incarnations the spiritual capacity to function consciously in multiple dimensions simultaneously. These children, Cayce said, would be born with consciousness structures already adapted to the multidimensional reality that older generations would struggle to perceive. What people born in the 20th century would have to learn through difficult spiritual practices and consciousness-expanding experiences, these children would see naturally. They would have innate understanding of energy, intuitive grasp of collective dynamics, immediate recognition of when someone was speaking from authenticity versus when they were performing social masks, and they would have no tolerance for the old power hierarchies, no patience for being told that authority comes from age or position or credential rather than from spiritual alignment and wisdom. Cayce said parents of these children would often feel confused, even intimidated by their offspring's clarity and spiritual authority. A 3-year-old who can see through emotional manipulation. A 5-year-old who asks questions about death and reincarnation that most adults have never contemplated. A 7-year-old who refuses to participate in school systems that treat learning as memorization rather than remembering. In one particularly poignant reading, Cayce gave guidance to a mother who was struggling with her unusually intense child. He said, "Do not try to conventionalize them. Do not force them into systems built for the old consciousness. What you perceive as behavioral problems are not deficits. They are immunity to obsolete programming. These children are not broken. They are simply incompatible with a world that is dying. And their discomfort with that world is a sign of their health, not their disorder." If you are a parent of a child born after 2020, especially if that child seems unusually sensitive, unusually defiant about arbitrary rules, unusually wise in moments when you least expect it, this is why they are not here to inherit the world you built. They are here to build the one that comes after. And your role is not to shape them into successful participants in the old system. Your role is to protect their authenticity while that system dissolves. To trust their knowing even when it contradicts everything you were taught, to let them teach you how to see what they see naturally. Cayce said the bridge souls would be essential to helping older generations navigate the consciousness rupture because they would not be frightened by multidimensional perception. It would be their native reality. They would be the guides we need when the veil thins completely. Now we reach the core revelation. The reason Edgar Cayce believed America's transformation, despite its difficulty, was ultimately a gift to global consciousness. He said America was never meant to be an empire. Not in its sole blueprint, not in its original spiritual purpose. It was meant to be a demonstration, a living experiment. What happens when souls from multiple ancient civilizations carrying multiple karmic streams, multiple cultural memories, multiple spiritual traditions, attempt to forge unity, not unity through forced homogeneity, not unity through one dominant culture, erasing all others, but unity through honored diversity, through recognizing that many expressions can serve one collective purpose. That experiment, Cayce said, had failed in its first 250-year cycle. The unity had been forced, not genuine. Built on stolen land and using stolen labor, that unity had suppressed diversity rather than celebrated it, and the karma of that failure had accumulated into an enormous energetic debt. Slavery, genocide, ecological devastation, the export of violence to other nations in the name of spreading democracy. All of it had to be fully metabolized, fully felt, fully acknowledged before the true experiment could begin. In a reading from 1939, someone asked Cayce what America's role would be after it completed this karmic accounting. And his response was extraordinary in its clarity. He said, America would become what he called the hearth of the New World. Not the ruler, not the dominator, but the hearth, the place where the fire is kept, the gathering space where others can come to warm themselves and receive light to take back to their own territories. He described post-2032 America as a place where the integration of matter and spirit would be modeled in practical, observable ways. Not through religion, not through politics, but through community structures that honored both individual sovereignty and collective coherence. New forms of education where young people were not taught to memorize, but guided to remember, guided to recognize what their soul already knows. New forms of healing would address not just physical symptoms, but the energetic and karmic roots of illness, with disease understood as a misalignment between soul purpose and life expression. New forms of governance would be based on wisdom rather than power, where leadership was service, not domination. New forms of economic exchange would be built on principles of energy rather than extraction, where value was measured by contribution to collective well-being rather than the accumulation of individual wealth. Cayce said other nations would watch these experiments unfold in America and adapt the principles to their own cultural contexts. But America, because of its unique karmic position, had to go first. It had to descend into chaos to discover what was indestructible at its core. And what would emerge from that discovery would light a path for the entire planet. Not through American exceptionalism, but through American humility. Through the willingness to admit failure, to grieve what was lost, to rebuild from truth rather than myth. The shift from empire to servant would be America's redemption. Edgar Cayce was not naive about the resistance this transformation would face. And in several readings he spoke with unusual intensity about what he called the old guard forces, both human and non-physical, that would actively work to prevent America's consciousness shift. He did not frame this in good versus evil terms. That was too simplistic. He described it as a natural response from structures and beings facing obsolescence. Every system builds thought forms, energetic patterns that have a kind of semi-autonomous existence. And when those systems are threatened, the thought forms fight to maintain themselves. Between 2027 and 2032, Cayce said there would be sophisticated attempts to manipulate public consciousness through fear, manufactured crises designed to make people cling to the old systems for perceived safety, economic threats, health scares, national security emergencies, all carefully timed to interrupt moments when collective awakening was accelerating. He described propaganda that would attempt to label the consciousness rupture as mental illness. Media campaigns suggesting that people experiencing multidimensional perception were dangerous to themselves and others. He warned about technologies that would be deployed to disrupt human biofields, frequencies broadcast through communication systems that would make it harder for people to access their own intuitive knowing. If this sounds paranoid, consider that Cayce was speaking about these possibilities in the 1930s and 40s, long before the technology to implement them existed. But here is what he emphasized repeatedly in reading after reading. This spiritual warfare could only succeed on people who had not done their inner work. Those who had cultivated discernment, who had cleared their own fear programming, who had learned to source guidance from within rather than from external authority, who had developed their own connection to higher wisdom. They would be immune to these manipulation attempts, not because they were special or chosen, but because they had done the work of becoming spiritually sovereign. In one reading, Cayce gave specific protection practices for those who sensed they were under spiritual attack or psychological manipulation. He said, "Attune to the Christ consciousness daily. Not the historical Jesus, but the frequency of unconditional love that he embodied. Make that your home frequency. Surround yourself with the white light of protection, but do it from a place of strength, not fear. You are not hiding from darkness. You are emanating light so bright that lower frequencies cannot approach. Stay grounded in your physical body. Evil thrives when people become disembodied, floating in fear and abstraction. Return to breath. Return to sensation. Return to presence. And most importantly, know yourself. The most powerful protection is self-knowledge. Fear cannot enter a consciousness that has fully accepted its own divine nature. This chapter is not meant to create paranoia. It is meant to create preparedness. Cayce's message was clear. The transformation will face resistance. But the resistance has no real power over those who have claimed their sovereignty. Edgar Cayce was not only a prophet. He was profoundly practical. Alongside his visions of America's spiritual transformation, he gave specific grounded advice on how individuals could physically prepare for the transition years. And this guidance remains remarkably relevant today. First, he spoke extensively about relocation, about safer lands during the earth changes. He identified specific regions that would experience less geological disruption. Parts of Virginia, particularly the southern and western areas, the Carolinas inland regions away from coastal flooding, but not so far west as to be affected by the mountainous instability, portions of the Ohio Valley. He said these areas would become natural gathering points for communities, places where people guided by inner knowing would find themselves drawn often without understanding why. Second, he gave detailed guidance on health and diet during the chaos years. He emphasized that physical vitality would be crucial, that the body needed to be a clear channel for the higher frequencies that would be flooding the planet. He recommended what we would now call an alkaline diet, more vegetables, particularly leafy greens, less meat. Though he was not dogmatic about vegetarianism, he said the key was consciousness, eating with awareness rather than compulsion. He also recommended regular fasting to clear both physical toxins and energetic debris, not extreme fasting, but periodic cleansing that gave the body rest and the soul more direct access to guidance, as well as avoidance of inflammatory substances, particularly refined sugars and processed foods, not from moral judgment but from practical necessity. These substances literally lower vibration, making it harder to perceive multidimensional reality. Third, he urged people to learn practical skills: gardening, how to grow food in your specific region and climate, how to save seeds, and how to work with soil as a living being rather than inert matter, herbalism, understanding which plants heal which conditions, how to make tinctures and salves, and how to work with plant spirit medicine, natural building techniques, how to create shelter using local materials and earth-friendly methods, water purification, how to find and clean water when municipal systems temporarily fail, and energy work, how to sense and direct life force, how to use the hands for healing, and how to clear spaces of negative thought forms. But then Cayce said something crucial, something that transforms all of this practical guidance from survivalism into spiritual practice. Do not prepare from fear. Prepare from wisdom. If your preparation is motivated by survivalist panic, by a belief that you must hoard resources to protect yourself from dangerous others, you will attract exactly what you fear. You will create isolation where you need community. You will create scarcity consciousness where you need abundance mindset. But if your preparation is motivated by practical love, by caring for yourself so you can serve others, by developing skills so you can contribute to collective well-being, then the preparation itself becomes a form of prayer. Every seed planted is an act of faith. Every skill learned is an offering. Every step toward self-sufficiency is simultaneously a step toward interdependence. Because you cannot truly help your community if you yourself are in desperate need. And you cannot be of service during crisis if you have not prepared during calm. This is the balance Cayce taught. Practical preparation held within spiritual trust. Before America can fully step into its true purpose, Edgar Cayce said it must complete a specific karmic accounting, a full reckoning with the violence its prosperity was built upon. This is the most difficult part of his prophecy, the part that cannot be bypassed or spiritually bypassed. He spoke about a period likely around 2030 to 2031 where the full weight of America's shadow would become psychically undeniable. The intergenerational trauma of slavery. The genocide of indigenous peoples. The ecological destruction justified by manifest destiny. The violence exported to other nations in the name of freedom. All of it would surface into collective consciousness simultaneously. Not as intellectual knowledge. Most Americans already know this history in abstract terms, but as felt experience, as grief that moves through the collective body, as shame that can no longer be defended against or rationalized away. Cayce said it would manifest as a kind of collective dark night of the soul, a period where the national identity would temporarily dissolve because the myths that sustained it could no longer hold. The myth of innocence, the myth of exceptionalism, the myth that America's success was earned rather than extracted. All of these stories would collapse under the weight of truth. And in that collapse there would be enormous pain. But Cayce insisted in reading after reading that this process was healing, not punishment. You cannot integrate what you have not acknowledged. You cannot transform what you refuse to see. America had spent centuries bypassing its grief, spiritually gaslighting itself with narratives that justified atrocity. That bypassing had created a massive energetic debt, and debt always comes due. The payment was not revenge. It was truth. Full truth. Felt truth. In one particularly moving reading, Cayce described the role that certain individuals would play during this collective grief process. He said there would be people who had already done their personal shadow work, who had faced their own darkness and emerged intact, who had metabolized their own trauma and learned how to alchemize pain into wisdom. These people would naturally become what he called grief holders for the collective. Not grief counselors in any professional sense, but people capable of feeling the sorrow without being destroyed by it. People whose processed pain gave them capacity to witness others' pain without trying to fix it or bypass it. If you have been through your own dark night, if you have faced your personal shadow and integrated it rather than projecting it outward, this is your purpose during America's darkest phase. You are not here to save anyone. You are not here to fix the collective wound. You are here to hold space while it heals itself. To be a stable presence in the storm. To model that grief can be felt fully without annihilation. To demonstrate that darkness when faced directly transforms into light. This is sacred work. And if you are being called to it, trust that calling. America needs your hard-won wisdom. Now, there is a tender truth in Edgar Cayce's readings that is often ignored because it creates discomfort. He said clearly that not every soul currently incarnated in America intended to remain through the full transformation. Some souls, he explained, came specifically to participate in the catalyst years, to experience the collapse, to contribute to the awakening through their very presence, and then to transition out before the rebuilding phase. This was not failure, it was completion. Cayce spoke about this with deep gentleness in multiple readings, particularly when people asked about loved ones who seemed to be making choices that would not allow for long-term survival. He said there would be increased transitions, what we call deaths, between 2027 and 2032, more than would normally be statistically expected. And many of these would be chosen at a soul level, not tragic accidents or premature losses. Some souls would complete their purpose in moments of crisis. Their contribution might be a single act of courage that inspired others, or their death might catalyze awakening in their family system, or their departure might create space for new energy to enter. This chapter speaks directly to two groups of